My father-in-law handed me divorce papers as an anniversary gift, but my envelope left him silent. Stay with me while I tell you what really happened that night. If this story touches you even a little, please consider supporting our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing it with those who matter to you. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of building a life with Ethan. I had dressed in a soft navy gown that flowed to the floor, something I knew Ethan once loved on me. The restaurant was one of the finest in the city, with candles flickering on every table and waiters gliding about like shadows. When we walked into the private dining room, the atmosphere was warm but heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ethan smiled at me as he pulled out my chair, but even in that smile I felt a distance. His eyes didn't hold the same spark they once had. I brushed the thought aside, telling myself I was just nervous about being around his parents again. Douglas Whitman, my father-in-law, was already seated at the head of the table. His presence filled the room in a way that made me want to shrink into myself. He was a powerful man, wealthy and always in control. To him, I was never good enough for his son. Beside him sat Martha, his wife. She gave me a faint smile, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. Martha was kind in her own quiet way, but years of living under Douglas's thumb had drained the strength from her voice. I sometimes wondered what she might have been if she hadn't married him. We made small talk at first, Ethan talking about his job, Douglas asking sharp questions that sounded less like interest and more like tests. I laughed when expected, nodded at Martha's timid remarks, but inside my chest there was a strange unease. Something was wrong. I could feel it like a draft creeping under the door. The waiter poured the wine, the plates were set, and just as I was about to take a sip, Douglas leaned forward with a smug look. He slid an envelope across the table toward me. "A little something for you, Clara," he said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. For a second, I thought perhaps it was a gift, something grand to mark the occasion. But deep down, I already knew better. I held my breath and slipped a finger under the flap, opening it slowly. My heart froze when I saw the word printed on the first page, divorce. I looked up, my face calm though my pulse thundered in my ears. Ethan avoided my eyes, staring down at his plate as though the silverware might save him. Douglas smirked, proud of the cruelty he had just delivered. Martha glanced at me with pity, but said nothing. I folded the papers back into the envelope, setting it neatly on the table as if it hadn't torn through my world. They thought I would break. They thought I would fall apart right there. But I had my own envelope waiting, one that none of them expected. Douglas leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The waiter had just placed steaming plates of food in front of us, but Douglas's attention was fixed on me. With a deliberate motion, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the polished wood table as though it were some kind of prize. "For you, Clara," he said smoothly, his voice loud enough to draw glances from the relatives seated nearby. His tone was sharp but playful, like he already knew what my reaction would be. I hesitated, staring at the envelope. My heart leapt with a tiny, fleeting hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was something different, perhaps a generous anniversary gesture, a check, or some recognition that after 10 years I had finally earned his approval. Ethan stayed quiet, his fork motionless in his hand. He didn't look at me, and that silence unsettled me more than Douglas's grin. I opened the envelope slowly, my fingers brushing the crisp paper inside. For a moment, I almost smiled, clinging to the idea that this was a surprise gift. But as soon as I saw the first bold letters, the truth landed like a stone in my chest. Divorce. Not only that, the papers were already signed. Ethan's name was scrawled across the line, sharp and final. My eyes stung, but I blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears show. Douglas leaned forward, his smugness filling the room. "Finally," he announced, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "Ethan is making the right choice. It took him far too long, but at last he's decided to free himself." The words echoed, slicing through the dim light of the restaurant. Martha gasped softly beside him, but as always, her protest died in her throat before it could reach the air. Ethan shifted in his seat, but still didn't meet my gaze. His cowardice burned more than the papers in my hands. I folded the documents carefully, as though they were nothing more than a dinner bill. My hands trembled under the table where no one could see. Inside, I was reeling, but outside, my face remained steady, calm, unreadable. Douglas wanted a scene, wanted me to fall apart in front of them all. He wanted to watch me crumble so he could feel victorious. But he didn't know me as well as he thought. I placed the envelope down beside my wine glass, aligning it neatly as if it hadn't shattered the life I had built. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I sat tall, my chin lifted. While Douglas gloated and Ethan wilted in silence, I reached for the second envelope resting inside my bag. My fingers brushed over it, steadying me. It was heavier than paper. It carried my preparation, my truth, and my quiet power. I didn't bring it out yet. Not tonight, not in front of their smug faces. But knowing it was there kept me from breaking. Douglas thought the game was finished. He had no idea it hadn't even begun. When I first met Ethan, we were both in graduate school. I remember the way he laughed during a seminar when the professor made a dry joke no one else understood. His laughter caught me off guard, warm and genuine, and for a moment the entire room faded. We started studying together, then sharing coffee breaks, and before long, we were inseparable. It felt like the kind of love that only happens once, the kind you'd give up anything for. And I did. Back then, I dreamed of working in publishing. Books had been my first love since childhood, and I was on track for a strong career. Internships, connections, professors rooting for me. But Ethan had bigger plans. He was chasing finance with long hours, networking dinners, and the kind of ambition that demanded support at home. I believed in him so completely that I set my own dreams aside. I took a steady but small job, something that left me flexible, available for him whenever he needed. I told myself it was temporary, just until he found his footing. Douglas, his father, made his disapproval clear from the start. He never raised his voice, but his words carried a sting sharper than shouting. "She's not the right class," he once muttered to Ethan, not realizing I was standing close enough to hear. To him, I was a distraction, a step down from what his son deserved. I wore the wrong clothes, came from the wrong family, and pursued a career that seemed too soft for his standards. Over the years, those judgments became a shadow over our marriage. Douglas never missed a chance to remind me of my place. He didn't need to be cruel outright. The small digs were enough. A raised eyebrow when I spoke at family dinners, a dismissive laugh when I mentioned my old publishing contacts, or his favorite line. Some people marry up, some marry down. I learned to smile through it, though each word left its mark. Ethan tried to defend me at first, but as his career grew and his father's approval mattered more, his defenses weakened. Soon, he stopped correcting Douglas altogether. He stopped noticing how small those comments made me feel. And slowly, I started to shrink, too, believing maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe I had been lucky just to stand by his side. 10 years passed that way, a slow erosion of who I used to be. I told myself love was worth the sacrifice, that one day Ethan would realize what I'd given up for him. I thought he would see me again, not just as the woman who kept his life running smoothly, but as the partner who once had dreams of her own. That's why the betrayal cut so deep. It wasn't just Ethan signing his name on divorce papers. It was the years I had laid down for him, the life I had let slip away, all dismissed with a single signature. The signs began as small ripples, the kind most wives notice but try to explain away. Ethan's work trips suddenly became more frequent, often scheduled at the last minute. He claimed his firm was handling urgent accounts that couldn't wait, but the excuses felt rehearsed hollow. I wanted to believe him. After all, I had stood by his side for a decade, but doubt crept in like a draft under a locked door. One evening, when he returned home later than promised, I hugged him and caught a faint trace of perfume on his shirt. It wasn't mine. The scent lingered in the air long after he set his jacket on the chair. When I asked casually if he'd been near anyone, he brushed me off with a quick laugh. "You're imagining things, Clara." His smile was too sharp, too quick. Then came the receipts. A folded slip of paper I found in his jeans pocket, showing a hotel room booked 2 towns over. The date circled back to a night he claimed to have stayed late at the office. My stomach twisted as I read it over and over. Another time, it was a charge for 2 glasses of wine at a rooftop bar. He told me he had skipped dinner that night, claiming exhaustion. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I tucked each clue away, careful not to leave a trace of my discovery. I started a folder, hidden deep inside a drawer only I opened. At first, it contained only that hotel receipt. But soon it grew, screenshots of messages that I quietly pulled from his unlocked phone. Photos of him arriving at places he shouldn't have been, evidence pieced together like a puzzle I never wanted to solve. And then I saw her name. Tessa Caldwell, 29 years old, a colleague from his office. Ambitious, sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who walked into a room and demanded attention. I remembered meeting her once at a company gathering. She had shaken my hand politely, her eyes already drifting toward Ethan. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, everything made sense. The late meetings, the sudden smiles at his phone, the long weekends he claimed were for networking trips. The betrayal was clear, but I chose silence. Not weakness, strategy. Confronting him too soon would only give him room to deny, to spin lies, to make me doubt myself again. Instead, I gathered every piece of proof carefully, methodically, until the folder in my drawer grew thick with the weight of his disloyalty. Each day I kept my composure, playing the part of the unsuspecting wife. Inside, though, I was steadying myself, waiting for the right time. Patience became my armor. Ethan believed he was clever, that his secrets were safe, but he had no idea I already knew everything. I wasn't just preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for the perfect moment when the truth would crush him, and no denial could save him. Douglas Whitman had always been a man who thrived on control. He ran his family the same way he ran his business: tight grip, sharp tongue, and no room for weakness. To him, I was weakness. From the very beginning, he never saw me as Ethan's equal, only as a placeholder until someone better came along. What I didn't realize at first was just how far he was willing to go to push me out. When I uncovered Ethan's affair, I also uncovered Douglas's fingerprints all over it. It wasn't just that he knew, it was that he had encouraged it. Douglas believed Tessa was the kind of woman who deserved to carry the Whitman name. She was young, polished, came from a wealthy family, and knew how to charm people in boardrooms. She checked every box he valued, the ones I never could. In his mind, Tessa was an upgrade, the proper wife for a man he was grooming to follow in his footsteps. The conversations between Ethan and Douglas revealed more than just approval. Douglas had promised him rewards, financial backing, access to new investments, and even property transfers, if he left me behind and started fresh with Tessa. To Douglas, it wasn't about love or happiness. It was about legacy and appearances. He saw marriage as a transaction, and I had depreciated in value. Ethan, always eager for his father's approval, leaned into it. I imagined the temptation was too strong. The promise of money, prestige, and his father's praise outweighed a decade of marriage and everything we had built together. I was nothing more than collateral damage in Douglas's plan. And the anniversary dinner, it was never meant to celebrate my marriage. It was designed as a stage, carefully arranged to humiliate me. Douglas orchestrated the moment with precision. The private dining room, the audience of relatives, the envelope slid across the table. He wanted to watch me crumble, to see me shrink beneath his smirk, while everyone witnessed my dismissal from their world. But what Douglas failed to understand was me. He mistook my patience for passivity, my silence for weakness. He thought I would break neatly, like glass under pressure, and quietly disappear from their lives without a fight. He underestimated what 10 years of sacrifice had made me: resilient, observant, and far stronger than he ever imagined. As he sat there that night, savoring his supposed triumph, he didn't see the resolve in my eyes. He thought the story was ending, but for me it was only beginning. He believed he had stripped me of dignity, when in reality, he had handed me all the proof I needed to show the world exactly who he and his son were. Douglas thought he had written the script, but I was already holding the pen. I remember the night I sat at my desk, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan was gone again, claiming another late meeting. I didn't bother asking where he really was. I already knew. Instead, I pulled out the manila envelope I had purchased earlier that day and placed it on the desk in front of me. The surface looked plain, harmless, but I knew what it would carry. It would be the weight of my freedom. One by one, I laid out the evidence I had collected over the months. Photographs of Ethan and Tessa stepping into hotels, their bodies angled close in ways that left no room for doubt. Credit card receipts showing dinners for two, rooms booked under his name, and luxury purchases that never made their way into our home. I added screenshots of text messages, his sweet promises to her, the same words he used to whisper to me years ago. Each piece was a cut, painful to hold, but necessary to keep. I arranged them carefully, almost like assembling a puzzle. With every page that slid into the envelope, I felt myself growing steadier. The woman who had once doubted her instincts was gone. In her place was someone who no longer flinched at the truth. But the evidence of his affair was only part of the arsenal. I reached for the folder my lawyer had prepared, a set of documents crafted with precision. For years, Douglas believed he had built an iron wall around his family's assets, untouchable to anyone who might try to claim them. But my lawyer found the cracks. The loopholes in trusts, the overlooked clauses, the financial blind spots Douglas never thought I would notice. Inside those pages was the proof that their wealth wasn't as protected as they believed. I ran my fingers over the legal documents before slipping them into the envelope alongside Ethan's betrayal. Together, they formed a story not of a helpless wife abandoned, but of a woman ready to dismantle the empire that had dismissed her. I sealed the envelope and sat back, staring at it for a long moment. My chest ached with a mixture of grief and resolve. I hadn't wanted this life, this kind of war. I had wanted love, family, and peace. But Douglas and Ethan had left me no choice. They had pushed me into a corner, and now I was stepping out with the only weapon I had, truth. That envelope wasn't just paper and ink. It was my shield, my sword, and my final act of defiance. I knew when the moment came, it would turn silence into chaos, arrogance into fear. And when it landed in Douglas Whitman's hands, it would end his control over me forever. I slid it into my bag, calm and steady. It waited quietly, just as I did, for the perfect moment. The room smelled of roasted duck and red wine, but all I could taste was the bitterness in my mouth as I unfolded the papers Douglas had given me. The word divorce sat bold at the top, Ethan's signature cutting across the bottom. I felt the sting in my chest, sharp and deep, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I smoothed the pages on the table with steady hands, lifting my chin as though this meant nothing at all. Across from me, Douglas leaned back with a smirk of triumph. He looked like a man savoring a long-awaited victory. Ethan, however, couldn't even look at me. His eyes darted anywhere else, the cutlery, the candles, the plate of untouched food before him. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of Martha's trembling glass as she tried to sip her wine. I folded the papers once more and set them neatly by my plate. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my face gave nothing away. They thought they had cornered me, stripped me of dignity in front of everyone at that table. But they didn't know what I had carried with me, waiting for this exact moment. I reached for my bag, my movements slow and deliberate. My fingers closed around the envelope I had prepared. Without a word, I placed it on the table and slid it toward Douglas. His smirk faltered, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He chuckled under his breath, as though I were making a desperate attempt to save face. "Clara," he said with mocking patience, "this isn't the time for..." But his words stopped when he opened the flap. The first photograph slid into the light, Ethan and Tessa, wrapped around each other at a hotel entrance. Then came receipts, credit card charges, screenshots of messages that left no room for denial. Each page spilled onto the polished wood like pieces of a shattered mask. The smirk drained from Douglas's face. His skin, usually flushed with arrogance, turned pale. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, the evidence piling higher with every second. The confidence that had filled the room only moments ago dissolved into a heavy, suffocating silence. Ethan finally looked at me then, his face red, his mouth opening and closing with no words forming. Martha covered her lips with her hand, her eyes wide in disbelief. The relatives at the table leaned closer, whispering, their gazes darting between the damning papers and the family unraveling before them. I sat still, calm, my hands folded in my lap. For once, it wasn't me shrinking under Douglas's shadow. It was him, caught off guard, stripped of control, undone by the very proof he had thought I'd never find. The silence in that room said more than shouting ever could. They had tried to humiliate me, but it was their own shame that spilled across the table that night. The papers lay scattered across the polished table, the damning photos and receipts glinting under the chandelier's soft light. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Douglas erupted. His fist slammed against the table, so hard the wine glasses rattled. "You fool," he roared, his face crimson with fury as he turned on Ethan. "How could you let this get out? How could you be so careless?" His voice cracked through the quiet room like thunder, every relative snapping their heads toward him. Ethan shrank back in his chair, stammering, "Dad, I didn't think. Clara wasn't supposed to." His words tripped over themselves, each excuse weaker than the last. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, and his hands twisted the napkin in his lap until it tore. Martha gasped, her hand pressed to her chest. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, shaking her head. The shock in her voice carried a sorrow I almost believed, though I knew she would never stand against her husband. Her eyes darted from me to Douglas, searching for some way to soften the disaster unraveling before her. Around the table, the whispers began. Relatives leaned close to one another, murmuring, their eyes darting between the evidence and the family at the center of the storm. I caught words like affair, scandal, ruined. Their hushed voices only added fuel to Douglas's rage. "You've embarrassed this family," Douglas spat at Ethan, slamming the papers back onto the table. "You couldn't even manage an affair discreetly. You've ruined everything." His voice cracked with more than anger. It was disappointment, sharp and cutting. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he had no defense. He looked trapped, cornered, his power stripped away. The man who once carried himself with confidence now sat hunched and broken, unable to meet anyone's gaze. And there I was, sitting tall, steady, calm. For years, I had been the one made to feel small at this table, the one Douglas sneered at, the one who swallowed her pride in silence. But not tonight. Tonight, I watched as their carefully built facade crumbled before them. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to argue or explain. My silence was louder than their fury, my composure sharper than Douglas's insults. Every time Ethan stammered and Douglas raged, the power shifted further away from them and into my hands. Douglas had thought this dinner would end with my humiliation. Instead, it ended with his. He looked betrayed, not by me, but by his own son's weakness, by the sloppiness that had allowed me to gather the proof. I let the chaos swirl around me, unmoved, unbothered. They wanted me to disappear quietly, but now they were the ones unraveling in front of their own family. For the first time in 10 years, I controlled the story. Not Douglas. Not Ethan. Me. And they could feel it in every silent second I held their eyes and refused to break. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of the legs against the floor cutting through the storm of whispers and angry voices. Every eye turned to me, expecting tears, a breakdown, maybe even a plea. Instead, I stood tall, smoothing the folds of my dress with steady hands. For once, I wasn't shrinking under Douglas's glare or Ethan's silence. I was rising above them both. "I won't be your victim," I said softly, but the firmness in my voice carried across the room. No one interrupted me. Douglas froze mid-rant. Ethan's mouth hung open as though he had forgotten how to form words. Even Martha, still clutching her pearls, sat frozen in place. Without another glance at the mess of papers on the table, I turned and walked out of the private dining room. Each step felt like shedding the weight I had carried for years. The insults, the sacrifices, the betrayals. Behind me, I could still hear Douglas muttering curses and Ethan's weak excuses, but they sounded distant now, like noise from a world I no longer belonged to. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside the restaurant. Parked by the curb was a familiar black sedan. The driver's door opened, and out stepped my lawyer, briefcase in hand. He had been waiting, just as we had planned. "Mrs. Whitman," he greeted me calmly, though his eyes flicked past me toward the building, as if expecting the Whitmans to come storming out. I nodded. "It's time." We moved to a small table set up beneath a streetlight, the papers already prepared and clipped neatly together. Legal documents, carefully crafted to freeze every joint account, every asset Ethan and Douglas might try to shift in the coming hours. They had thought they were untouchable, but I had anticipated this night. My lawyer had ensured there would be no frantic phone calls to banks, no sudden transfers to hidden trusts. He slid the first page toward me, and I picked up the pen with steady fingers. My hand didn't shake, not once, as I signed my name. It was a moment I had dreaded and dreamed of all at once, not an ending marked by tears, but a beginning sealed with ink. When the last signature was complete, my lawyer gathered the papers with quiet efficiency. "It's done," he said simply. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Not a sob, not a cry, just a release, like finally setting down a burden carried too long. For the first time in years, my shoulders felt lighter. I looked back at the restaurant only once. The windows glowed warmly, but inside was nothing for me anymore. Only arrogance and betrayal imploding on itself. Then I turned away, walking down the street with quiet strength. My life with the Whitmans was over. And as the night air wrapped around me, I knew I wasn't leaving broken. I was leaving free. Weeks passed, and the Whitman name began to crack like porcelain dropped on stone. Douglas, once untouchable, found himself dragged through endless court hearings. The documents I had slipped across that dinner table became the foundation for lawsuits and investigations. Former associates distanced themselves, investors pulled out, and whispers of his downfall filled the business pages. The man who once looked down at me with smug superiority was now plastered across headlines, his arrogance exposed to the world. Ethan fared no better. Without Douglas's steady hand and promised wealth, his polished image fell apart. The colleagues who used to flock around him drifted away, unwilling to be tied to a sinking ship. And as for Tessa, her devotion lasted only as long as the money did. When the accounts froze and the promises of lavish gifts disappeared, so did she. One day she was spotted on the arm of a new prospect, leaving Ethan in an empty apartment filled with broken dreams. I watched all of this unfold quietly, not with gloating laughter, but with a steady calm. Justice, when it came, didn't need fireworks. It simply needed time. In the middle of all this chaos, I began building something new. I had spent years giving, sacrificing, bending myself into the shape they demanded. Now, for the first time, I shaped a life that belonged only to me. I found a small home by a lake, surrounded by trees that turned golden in the afternoon light. The house wasn't grand, not compared to the Whitman estate, but it was mine. Every brick, every corner, every view out the window felt like a declaration of freedom. I furnished it slowly, choosing each piece with care. No more cold, heavy furniture chosen to impress others, only warmth and comfort that reflected who I truly was. The day I moved in, I sat on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the water, painting the lake in shades of orange and violet. The silence was peaceful, not heavy. It was the kind of quiet that felt like possibility instead of emptiness. That night, I opened a small velvet box I had hidden away weeks earlier. I had bought it before the anniversary dinner, intending it to be a gift for Ethan. Inside was a set of keys, the keys to this very house. Back then, I thought they would symbolize a fresh start for us as a couple. Instead, they became something far greater. I held them in my palm, their cool metal pressing into my skin, and smiled. They no longer represented a shared dream. They represented my independence, my freedom, and the life I had chosen for myself. I didn't just survive what Douglas and Ethan did to me. I turned their betrayal into my liberation. And as I locked the door to my new home that night, I knew I had finally fully walked away, not as their victim, but as my own beginning. What about you? Do you believe Clara made the right choice by leaving it all behind, or should she have tried to fix things with Ethan and his family? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear them. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next one.